During World War II, as England became more and more desperate in their situation to fight off Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill created the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. I don't know if you've heard, there's been a movie recently made about that. I didn't know it was a real thing. But apparently it was a real thing, and it was called that because it described the tactics that would be used by the British in their desperation to fight the Nazis. And so what it is the name refers to the use of deceptive, aggressive, and sometimes brutal methods necessary in war. But the irony of it is, if you think back in our history, the U.S. actually used it against the British in the Revolutionary War. And so we stood no chance in our desperation in lining up on a battlefield, defeating an enemy that was much bigger, much more powerful. And so we began to use guerrilla warfare tactics. We began to use spies. And my favorite is the story of the crossing of the Delaware on Christmas Day. Some say Christmas Eve. I think it was actually Christmas Day. At night, under the cover of darkness, to defeat the enemy. And some say that was a turning point in the Revolutionary War. But it's somewhat humorous if you think about the opposite. If you think that there could be such, if that's called ungentlemanly warfare, it's interesting to think that there's such a thing as gentlemanly warfare. Okay, we hate each other. We're going to kill each other today, but let's act like gentlemen about it. Kind of hard to grasp such a thing. But it's humorous to think that was the way that some thought. Can you imagine, SEAL Team 6 knocking on Osama bin Laden's door and saying, okay, we're going to give you a sporting chance. You've got a 30-minute head start. Maybe that might be considered gentlemanly warfare. I'm not sure. But an element of surprise is sometimes needed. Even deception is sometimes necessary in winning wars. And we even see this in the Bible, and we especially see this in the book of Judges, where we've been for a few weeks now. The book of Judges is a historical book with real-life events taking place in real-life history. The story of the beginning of Judges begins after Israel has taken the promised land by the leadership of Joshua and under the headship of Yahweh, their Lord. But it also ends before the monarchy takes place. So Israel's had no king yet. God was intended to be their king. But there's a problem. Israel did not follow the directions of the Lord. They did not do what the Lord had told them to do. Before they took the land, even going all the way back to Abraham, they were told to purge the evil from the land. And God told them, don't leave any of the inhabitants alive or remaining in the land. And so they were told to completely conquer this area, this territory that God had promised to Abraham years before this. So the inhabitants of the land, as they're referred to in the Old Testament, they were people who worshiped false gods. And flowing out of their false worship led to the devaluing of human life and marriage and family. And so this evil was spreading across the land like poison. And it was taking place in a land that God had declared his land. And in the land that God had promised to Abraham and his descendants, evil was spreading, and evil had been left kind of sprinkled throughout the nation of Israel after they had conquered the land. They did not follow God's instructions. And so they did not heed God's warnings. And so Judges is kind of the story of what happens when you don't listen to the Lord and do what he asks you to do. But we're going to be in Judges chapter 3 today. And we'll break it down into chunks like I usually try to do. But we've got some interesting stories today, so don't fall asleep on me. Don't think about lunch yet. But Judges chapter 3, And really 1 through 6 kind of belong to last week's lesson. But you can read that later if you want. But Judges 3, 7 through 11. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherah. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over him, over Cushan-Rishathaim, so the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So here we learn a lesson that I've talked about before, but I think it's an important thing that kind of sets us up for understanding the book of Judges. And I think this is a lesson that we see over and over in the book of Judges. And it's the reality that physical battles often follow lost spiritual battles. When we lose spiritual battles, when we aren't doing what God tells us to do, it tends to lead towards earthly conflict. And often when you see wars like this, you think, wow, what could have prevented that? And it made me think of Ephesians chapter 6, which is the famous chapter where we read about the armor of God. But Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12 helps us understand where the real battle takes place. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. This was Israel's number one enemy. This is our number one enemy today. And so the rest of the chapter of Ephesians 6 kind of gives us the battle plan for spiritual warfare, and we'll come back to that at the end. But that's really more for you to read on your own. But because we live in a physical world, we're of the flesh. We're surrounded by physical things. Our eyes see physical things. We tend to ignore the invisible battle, the spiritual battle that is taking place. And when we lose spiritual battles because we're simply just ignoring them or pretending that they're not going on, the physical battles come. And so this is the recurring theme, or one of the many recurring themes, and really a pattern in Judges. Verse 7 says that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. We've already seen this 2 or 3 times. And it repeats itself over and over. And they forgot the Lord their God, and they served idols. So they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They drifted away from God to the point where they forgot about him, and they began to serve idols. Now, there was no shortage of idols, as I have kind of already tried to explain. Idolatry was just kind of sprinkled throughout the land. If you go back to Judges 1, if you missed that, it kind of covers, as Israel went to take on their distribution of the land, their inheritance, it seemed like almost every one of them did not do the task that they were told to do. Therefore, it left a remnant of idolatry in their section of the territory. And so idolatry sprinkled throughout. There's all kinds of gods that they created themselves to worship. And so Israel itself served them. And when it says serve, that could be just really another word for worshiping them. But they served them. They followed religiously, devotion. They were devoted to doing what was required of them for this idol worship. They would make sacrifices, and they would pray to these gods and these kinds of things. And so their devotion to the Lord was stolen and was given to these fake gods. Fake gods that could not interact with them or help them or deliver them, as we will see. Just as much as Judges highlights how God delivers, it really is highlighting that idols don't do anything. And so that is a contrast in the book of Judges that we need to not overlook. But the poison of idolatry had spread through God's people, not just the land. Really, the issue was the invisible spiritual battle. And so they had drifted further and further from God to the point that they had totally forgotten about him. They had forgotten about all his victories in battle, the miracles that took place in Abraham's time and Moses' time. And so they just wanted, it was just a difficult time for them, a spiritually dark time. And so verse 8 says that this great sin brought the anger of the Lord. And it says specifically that it was kindled. It was kindled. If you think about a match, these fires in California, I remember the fires years ago in the Smokies, was started with someone flinging a match on the ground. And so it's kind of like this little spark that's lit of God's anger. And maybe that's hard to grasp, that God gets angry, because God is without sin. God is sinless. He's holy. He's righteous. He's just. But it does say that he has anger. And we like to kind of pretend that God is just this nice grandpa type figure that everyone loves. He's always nice. He's never angry. He never, disagrees with us. He celebrates all of our things that we do that are wrong. But God can be angry and not sin. His anger is not tainted by sin. Our anger is usually tainted by sin. Our anger is rooted in sin often, and often rooted in our pride. But the Lord's anger is always righteous. And so when we see that he is angry, we need to be careful that we don't picture his anger the way we picture someone losing their temper because they didn't get to eat what they wanted for dinner, or because someone didn't do what they wanted them to do. And so this refers here, his anger is directed towards their idolatry. And so it's almost that of a righteous husband dealing with an adulterous wife. That's kind of the picture that the Bible gives us. And it refers to Israel as whoring after other gods. It talks about them being the unfaithful bride. But notice his anger is directed at his people. His anger isn't directed at the pagan worshipers because they don't belong to him. His anger is directed at his people who are worshiping the other gods because they've been influenced by those who do not belong to him. And so we tend to think, and we get a little bit self-righteous in our world today, and we always think, oh, God is judging those people. But often in the Old Testament, we see a lot of God's anger and his wrath is used to discipline his very own people. And it's not because he hates them. He's actually disciplining them because he loves them, because he wants to do what is necessary to draw them back into his presence, to reconcile with them. And so God will do what he needs to do to wake his people up, to get their attention, so that they realize, oh, I can't believe I'm worshiping this wooden statue here. Oh, I can't believe that I made this thing more important than God in my life. I can't believe that I totally lost it on this person because I didn't get my way. And so all of these things kind of come out of, whenever we replace God with anything. But his people should have known better. They were called to holy living. He said, just as I am holy, you shall be holy. That's a message in the New Testament also given to the church. Just as we are holy, we are declared holy through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, so we are called to be holy. If holy is your identity, you're called to live it out in real life, in real time, in practical, tangible ways. And so this is, God, they were to be God's people, to be a light in the darkness. And so how's God supposed to affect those idol-worshiping pagans? except through his own very own people who are supposed to be the light to the world, even in the Old Testament. And so this is why we exist today. The church, we exist to be a light to the world. We're to be a city on a hill, showing people in the darkness that there's a different way, that there is truth, that God does care, that he does exist, that he is real, and that he does love us and wants to help us and wants what's best for us. But we have to do it his way. And so we need to make sure that we don't ever make church in the Christian faith about us, or we will totally miss the point. And we will get distracted, and we will wander off into idolatry, and we will run the risk of being opposed by the very God that saved us in the first place. So he warned them about this, but they didn't listen. He warned them what would happen, and that's exactly what's happening in the book of Judges. God keeps his word every time. God is faithful with his promises every time. So verse 8, it says that he sold them into the hand of Cushan Rishathaim. I had to say that way too many times. King of Mesopotamia. And his name means Cushan of double wickedness. So that ought to tell you how wicked this guy was. God did not, and when it says he sold them into their hands, God did not make money off of some transaction here. It's an expression of really allowing his people to go into slavery, basically being a conquered people. And that's the situation. Just like he did not literally hold the swords in battle, but the Old Testament says that the Lord won the battle. So this is kind of an expression of the imagery of slavery, but it's really just referring to them being conquered. And it says they served, which is a word indicating some kind of slavery or being conquered. They served this king for 8 years. So kind of quickly looking at the big picture here, the book of Joshua, they conquered the land, they distributed the land, and here we are, now they are conquered for 8 years. How quickly things went downhill because they turned away from God. They were under captivity for 8 years. Now, in light of, in comparison, this is 8 years is not that long compared to, if you think about it, they were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And if you look forward to Judges, it increases each time. But the exiles that come later on in the history of Israel, 8 years is not that long. But imagine being a conquered people for even just 8 years. That would be the longest 8 years of our life, you know? And so we need to kind of put ourselves in their shoes. Imagine being in captivity for 8 years. And what would make it even harder and longer is knowing that it was our own fault. God told us this would happen. He warned us over and over and over, and we did it anyways, and here we are. You know, that would just make the clock tick even slower. You know, when you're paying too much, maybe at work, you never watch the clock at work. That's just not a good idea because it just makes it go slower. And so when you're watching the clock, if you're waiting something for whatever, you can almost hear the tick getting louder and louder. I remember sitting in class, watching the clock, waiting for class to be over, and I could almost hear the tick-tock getting louder and louder because I just wanted to go eat lunch. And so hopefully that's not the case for you right now, but this, in a sense, would be how they felt in captivity, only for 8 years, but knowing it was their fault. And so verse 9 tells us that they got desperate enough to remember, oh yeah, there's God. And it took 8 years of captivity for this to happen. And they remembered God, and it says that they cried out to the Lord. And what did it take for them to turn back to God? It took desperation. And that's one of our main themes today, is desperation. And so, did God say, sorry, I don't love you anymore, Satan can have you, I'm done with you, wash my hands of you? Is that what he said? That is not what he said. The Lord says that the Lord raised up a deliverer or a judge who saved them and delivered them. And the first judge we come across is Othniel. He was Caleb's younger brother. And if you remember Caleb, all the way back in Joshua, he was kind of one of the original spies with Joshua. And when Israel first came to the promised land, they sent in spies. So we see kind of some deception and spies being used there as well in the Old Testament. And there was 4 or 6, I can't remember, when they came back from spying on the land, Caleb and Joshua came back with what I call the faithful report. And they said, this is some great stuff here. We can do this. Let's go conquer the land. That was God's plan. But then there were some other spies that came back and they were like, we look like crickets to these guys. They look like giants, and there's too many, and we're not going to do this. We're going to die. We're not going to make it. And so Israel kind of panicked, and they freaked out, and they complained, and God said, okay, back into the wilderness you go. Because they did not listen to Caleb and Joshua. So here we are, kind of descendants of that faithfulness. But he is first mentioned in chapter 1, if you remember that part. You can go back and look there this week. But he wins Caleb's daughter through victory in battle. So that's part of the story here. But he was more of a younger man in chapter 1. But this story gives him kind of this supernatural power, if you will. The Lord raises him up to do this mighty deed. And that's another theme that we see, is that God raises these judges up in kind of this supernatural way to accomplish tasks that might be deemed mission impossible. And so the beginning of chapter 3 says that many of them, they were in idolatry, many of them were unequally yoked, and they were marrying women from these other beliefs, which God had told them not to do. But Othniel was faithful and married an Israelite woman. And so he went out to war, and the Lord gave him victory. And it says the land had rest for 40 years. And then Othniel died. So another pattern we will see is that when the judges die, the peace is over. And very quickly they go back into idolatry. So the peace in Judges is always temporary. It's never permanent. And every time they compromise their faith, they end up back into physical battles. And the same can be true for us. The same can be true for us. But it's not always a literal battle on the battlefield. Sometimes it's relationship conflicts. Sometimes it's financial stress. Sometimes it can be even sickness, or just feeling tired, or losing sleep, or just, confusion. And so these things can be kind of the physical battles that we deal with today. And sometimes it is because we pull back from God and we lose spiritual battles. And so anything that God can do to use to get our attention to turn back to Him, He will use it to draw us back into Him. He never wants separation from us. He always wants connection with us. He wants to be a part of our lives. And so the best thing really, we need to be careful that every time something bad happens, we don't think, oh, God's punishing me. You can't go through life like that. And really, you don't know. So really the best thing for us to do is to see every situation as a good opportunity, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as a good opportunity to turn to God and worship Him in the good and the bad. And so the reality is sin has consequences. Sometimes we don't really know exactly what they are. Sometimes it's super clear what they are because they're so immediate. But we need to remember that if we are compromising in the spiritual battles, there will be physical consequences that will follow that. And that's in Judges. So let's keep reading. 3:12 to 30. And this story, this is where things get really interesting here. All right. One of my favorite stories in the Bible. I should have had some guys come up and enact this live. I forgot to do that. All right. Judges 3, verse 12. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites and went and defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms. And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Notice the service gets longer. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. And Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded, Silence! And all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him as he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat, and Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. And the hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and the dung came out. Then Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. Okay, we're going to keep going to 30. When he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw that the doors of the roof chamber were locked, they thought, surely he is relieving himself in the closet of the cool chamber. And they waited till they were embarrassed. But when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them, and there lay their lord dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sarah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, Follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at that time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest for 80 years this time. So isn't that a fun little story? So here we can learn, as we will see over and over in Judges, that desperate times call for desperate measures. And I think if you think about this story, it's kind of a desperate measure, is it not? And so here we find the story of the second judge, Ehud. And so there seems to be some intentional humor in this story in the midst of a pretty graphic, just kind of interesting story. But also there seems to be a theme of secrecy that's intended throughout this story. And so the question that can raise as we read this and we think about the spies that I mentioned before and perhaps even some of the later stories, is deception okay for the Christian? I mean, that would be a logical question to ask. Is deception ever okay for the Christian? And perhaps this might be more of an opinion answer, but I believe in extreme cases, it's the lesser of two evils. And most of the time when I think about this, the situation that comes to my mind is lying to the Nazis to save the Jews, which many Christians did. I don't know about many, but some of them lied to the Nazis because they were hiding Jews in their home or different places. And you have to ask yourself in that situation, what is the lesser of two evils? And so, Othniel was the first judge, and he died. The people went back to their old habits, and like a dog returning to its own vomit, they end up in idolatry once again. They did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. But notice, again, God strengthened Eglon, or Eglon. He's the pagan, wicked king here. He's the guy spreading the poison that's spreading the evil through the land. And it says God strengthened him. So God used this pagan king to discipline his kids. Isn't that interesting? A theme throughout the Old Testament, not just the book of Judges. And so Eglon gathered a couple of allies, and these allies kind of had some history with Israel, so it was an easy sell for them, I think. And they went to battle with Israel. They took the city of Palms, which is the city of Jericho. We read that Joshua fought the battle of Jericho, one of the nice songs I remember from Vacation Bible School as a kid, and the walls came tumbling down. Okay, Jericho's been destroyed. And so it's some form of Jericho, but a shadow of what it used to be as a city. But Israel had to serve Eglon of Moab 18 years. So the service is longer this time. God increasingly is just desperate to get his people's attention, to get them to come back to him. And so they became desperate, and they cried out again in desperation to the Lord. And God did not say, you know what, you're not mine anymore. I've washed my hands of this mess. Satan can have you. King Eglon can have you. That's not his response. And it's interesting that it seems like the only time they called God was when they used the crisis hotline. It's like the only number they knew for God was 911. And if they weren't dialing 911, they didn't know how to get in touch with the Lord. They didn't have him on speed dial. They only had him when it was in a crisis mode, when they were desperate. But the thing we need to see from God is that he always listens to his people, and he hears our cries for help, even when we are not faithful, and he raises up another judge. And his name is Ehud. He was a Benjaminite, which is interesting because Benjamin means the son of right hand or son of my right hand, and Ehud was left-handed. It points that out to us. And it's interesting he points that out. He's kind of built for this task. I think it's kind of isolating that God kind of picked him for this task, and it may have even had something to do with him being left-handed. And so Ehud here is, you can see this in a couple of different ways. It almost seems like he's kind of this divine hitman sent to assassinate a wicked man, but also kind of like special forces, just kind of like if Ehud had a whole gang with him, what he accomplished here wouldn't have been able to be accomplished. And so it uses secrecy and deception and things like that. And so Israel, as a conquered people, they would have had to have paid tribute to Eglon, which is money or maybe grains or agricultural things. It's kind of a form of a tax to the victor, right? And so Israel chose Ehud to be that person that would present it to the king. So that's the setup right there, right? Like he is being put in the exact position he needs to be to accomplish this task that God gives to him, which just happens to be assassination this time. So the next part of the deception had to do with his weapon. And at this point, okay, now you know what his motivations are. Ehud made himself a sword that was small enough to bind around his right thigh and to hide it under his clothes. And we also know that it's a weapon of deception, right? So he can just march right into the palace and pull it out when he needs to surprise his enemy. But it's also a double-edged sword. And so this isn't a sword for like chopping food or, this is a sword for poking a hole in this guy. It was meant for stabbing. It was a violent weapon. And so it says that it was a cubit, or which may be like from the elbow to knuckles or elbow to fingertips. So that would fit on his thigh, so he could conceal it. And he didn't care if he had a concealed carry permit. He would have made a great West Virginian. He didn't ask their permission, basically, to bring this in. But he wore it under his robe, and he went in to present the tribute to the king. And the description of Eglon is great, isn't it? Verse 17, the Lord in his divine wisdom decided that the Bible needed to tell us that he was a very fat man. So it's like, okay, thanks for sharing. Why is that necessary? I mean, I sat there and thought about this, and it's, and I think it's part of the humor that's kind of there. The ironic thing is that his name means little bull or bull calf. So kind of in the Hebrew, we missed this in the English, there's kind of this image of, he's kind of setting him up to be kind of the sacrificial calf, the fatted calf. So it's a little bit of a stretch, but that seems to be there. In Hebrew, we don't pick up on all that stuff. But it also kind of sets him up to be kind of an easy kill, right? He would be slow moving, defenseless if isolated, if he could get him by himself, and so that's kind of what happens. So Ehud, by the power of God, he kind of manipulates this situation to isolate Eglon, and Eglon's just thinking he's king of the mountain, and he has no clue about what's about to happen to him. So verse 19 tells us that Ehud, he gives his tribute, and they're all leaving. But then it says he turns back at the idols, or your translation might say stones, which they would have been little stone idols. And perhaps that would be like marking the territory crossing into Israel. It seems to indicate that later in the story. But he turns around and he comes back and he tells King Eglon, hey, I've got a secret message for you. And if Eglon was watching this take place, it's kind of hard to picture, but he might have seen him turn around at the idols and think, oh, this message is from the idols. My gods have kind of given you this secret message, so to speak. But you would think this guy, here he is, king of the mountain. He's this conquering king. You wouldn't think he would be so gullible, but he really just seems gullible here. And you would think that they would have been on high alert, like protecting their leader from assassination and all these things. But even his inner circle seems to be kind of clueless about what Ehud is about to do. But King Eglon gets really excited. Oh, he's got a message for me. And he says, everybody hush, which basically, hey, get out. And he gets everybody to leave the room, and it's just him and Ehud together alone. It says they're in this cool roof chamber, which was kind of this smaller room on the roof, just kind of meant for more private meetings. And so this plan is gone, perfectly up to this point. And so he gets them isolated, and he tells them one more time, he's like, hey, I've got a message from God. Right? So he kind of adds this, hey, this is not just a letter from me to you. This is a divine message. And so Eglon and he's just kind of naive, and he gets excited and he stands up. And that was the point. Because Ehud needed to get Eglon to stand up so he could thrust the sword into his stomach. And so this is what takes place. He stabs him in the stomach, and he thrusts it in so hard that the fat encloses over the entire sword. Okay? Which might indicate as to how big this guy might be. The handle disappears. And Ehud just says, okay, you can have it. I'm going to leave it here. And so he thrusts it in so hard, the sword is completely swallowed up, which is interesting because they may not have found, you look for the weapon for of the crime. There was no weapon to be seen at the scene of the crime. But this is just kind of the humor and things. I guess we can kind of look at this, but Ehud isn't done. He's got to escape, right? So he continues kind of his deceptiveness. He shuts the doors to the room. He locks them, and then he takes off and he leaves. But after he's gone, it's interesting. The humor kind of continues with his servants, right? So his servants are outside, and they've been waiting a really long time, and they're kind of sweating at this point. Like, they waited so long, it says they were embarrassed. And so, they're thinking, well, maybe he's going to the bathroom. It's like thinking, hey, Eglon, did you fall in? Like, hey, are you okay in there? Nobody called. They just sat there. I guess they were probably somewhat scared of him, as they might have been rulers. But finally, after much embarrassment, they open the doors and they find him dead on the floor. And Ehud, the judge, is gone with the wind, so to speak. He's escaped. God and his deceptive plan worked. Doesn't it sound weird saying that? But God is the one directing this whole thing. The divine hitman was victorious, as weird as it is to say that. But now, at this point, there's no more need for deception. Ehud, he goes, he escapes, he runs back to his own territory, and it says he sounded a trumpet to announce his victory, and Israel makes him their leader. They followed him into battle against the Moabites, and they took back their land. And it says in verse 29, it says they killed 10,000, and it's very specific here, strong and able-bodied men. And it's interesting that it highlights that, and I think what it's doing is it's indicating that there's a supernatural power behind not just Ehud, but Israel here. That they're able to take on a much more probably qualified, able-bodied military here. And it's an indication of God's power behind his people. And so they were the underdogs, but they had the Lord, and he gave them the victory, as we see throughout the Old Testament. Verse 30 said the land had rest for 80 years this time. But that's still kind of like one generation's lifetime. And the people, they cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud. And as we can see in this situation, that wartime is not pretty. And it's sad. And we don't want to become numb to the violence that's in this story. But at the same time, we see that God will do what is necessary to deliver his people, to get his people's attention. And so the story of Judges is a story of desperation. Over and over and over, the people were desperate and cried out to the Lord. And so the question I have for us today is, do we feel desperate? Do you have a sense of desperation right now? Desperation for what's around you. Do you recognize the stronghold that Satan and sin and the spiritual forces of darkness has in this world today? Do you think about that and recognize that and feel some desperation of that, the reality of that? Do you recognize it in other nations as you watch the news or read the news? Or heaven forbid, actually go to another nation and see what's going on there firsthand? Do we recognize it in our own nation and what's happening here? Do we recognize it in our government, in our schools, in our businesses, and yes, even in our churches? Do we recognize it in our families, in our homes, and really where it starts, in our very own hearts? Do we recognize the influence of evil in the world? Because if you think about all those different locations that I just mentioned, it's sprinkled everywhere. Because the evil has not been purged from the land. The reality is that we are not living in peacetime. And when you are not living in peacetime, you don't have a peacetime mindset. You have a wartime mindset. It's a very different way of living. And so the reality is that we are not in a peaceful time right now. There is a war that is raging for people's souls. And sadly, the very safety and prosperity that we can often take for granted because of where we live can be used to fool us into thinking that life is good as long as I'm safe and comfortable and there is no battle taking place. Oh, how the enemy loves to put us to sleep with that way of thinking. But you see, becoming desperate helps us to wake up. Becoming desperate forces us to open our eyes and to be alert to what is going on in the world today. And so let me ask you this. What would you do, thinking about the story of Ehud and blowing the trumpet, what would you do if a watchman blew the trumpet and you were called to battle in the Spirit? What would be your first move? Would you even know what to do? Would you have a battle plan? And we need to be reminded that the enemy isn't coming. You see, we don't need watchmen to tell us that the enemy is coming anymore, because the enemy has been in the land. And by in the land, I just mean among humans across the globe. The enemy is here. His presence can be felt from our hearts to our homes, to our communities, to the nations. And so we need to be careful that we don't get put to sleep in thinking that we're not living in wartime, because that's one of the greatest lies of the enemy. And it's been said that his greatest weapon is convincing the people that he doesn't exist at all. And so we have no threat. Oh, there's nothing to worry about. Oh, you're just being extreme. You're being crazy. That's not what we see in Scripture. And so the war is not for the promised land. The war is not even, dare I say, for the U.S. The war is for the souls of people, because that's where eternity is taking place. If you go back to Ephesians chapter 6, I encourage you to go there this week. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there. Chapter 6, verse 13 says, since you're at war, like there's no, hey, if you have war, it's like, since you're there, whether you want to be or not, take up the armor of God. And it's interesting, the interesting thing about armor, some armor is for defense, some armor is for offense. And Ehud created that great sword. He didn't have a shield, but he went in on offense. And so often as Christians, we're on defense, and we just kind of hide in our bubbles, and we protect ourselves, and we know we're secure in our salvation, and our doctrine, helps us feel secure. But what about going on offense? How often are we using the sword? How often, which Ephesians says is the word of God, how often are we using, it says that God empowered these people to do this. God can empower us to move forward. We don't want to just hold our ground. It's interesting, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Have you thought about that? We often think about that defensively. That's an offensive thing. Who's pounding against the gates of hell? That's an offensive perspective on that. And so it talks about the armor of God in Ephesians 6. In verse 18 it says, to that end, keep alert. It lists all these great things we can do to prepare for spiritual battles. And it's like, okay, you got your armor on. To that end, because of that, now you have that, be alert. Keep alert. Wake up. Don't get so comfortable that you forget about God and then drift from God and end up in desperation. But it is time, in one sense, to get a little desperate, to feel desperation for our own lives, but also for the souls that are around us. And desperate times call for desperate measures. What does Israel do when they get desperate? The only place that we can start when we're in battle is they cry out to the Lord. That's your job, number one, is to cry out to the Lord. It's got to start there. This is the first thing we should do when we think about the call to battle. Okay, this is a desperate situation. I can't do this without God. Each time Israel's desperate, they cry out to God. For all their mistakes, all their flaws, as horrible and as violent as the time as it is in Judges, when things get desperate, they cry out to God. And each time it gets bad, God is the one who provides salvation. God is the one who raises up a judge in a supernatural way so that they can deliver them from evil. God is the one who provides the supernatural power to deliver us from evil. And so, do we feel the desperation for our own souls? That's where we got to start. Do we feel the weight of our sin? I think I might have asked this last week. Have you considered the weight of your sin? The reality is that we are all like sheep who have gone astray. The Bible says that none of us are righteous. Not one of us is righteous. We are all horrible, wretched sinners in desperate need for a great Savior. The question is, though, are we desperate enough to cry out to God for help? And if we have, and if we're willing to, He hears our cries for help, and He has sent us the great deliverer, Jesus Christ. Through the death on the cross and through His resurrection, He has done what none of these judges that we're about to read through could accomplish. The peace was always temporary. The awakenings, the spiritual awakenings were always temporary. But Jesus Christ, through His death and His resurrection, provides permanent deliverance from the great enemies of sin and death and Satan himself. He did not accomplish this by thrusting a sword through a fat man. He did it by being nailed to a cross Himself and sacrificing His own life and taking on God's wrath for us by dying in our place. And so, in our desperation, right here and right now, we're getting ready to do the Lord's Supper together. We need to prepare our hearts for that. And so, I want to invite you to turn to Him now and cry out to Him through prayer. First of all, tell Him that you recognize that you are a great sinner, that you are a great sinner in desperate need for a great Savior. And confess your faith in Jesus Christ to Him. And in that moment, you will be delivered from evil for eternity. You will receive a new spirit by the power of the Holy Spirit, a supernatural thing that we can't accomplish. And God will continue to guide you through this life, through the good, the bad, and the ugly. But also, if you're here today and you are a believer, and maybe you've been kind of put to sleep, so to speak, just go to the Lord and confess your sin. Cry out to Him in desperation as His child, and ask Him to renew your strength, to renew your mind, to strengthen your love for the souls that are around you. And so let's spend some time going to the Lord and reflecting on these things, and then we'll begin the Lord's Supper.